Right. And I think we're good. All right. Hello, everyone. We are coming in for, I believe, what is this? The second, I think it's our second video of the month. Second video that we've had for June. Because I don't count the one that I did last week as full on video. So this is our second video for the month of June. And for our video for today, I started getting this ready and then decided that the best choice of going along with this is going to be to probably split it. Because if I try to condense everything into a single video, it's going to be very tedious and very, overwhelming if I were to do it in a single video. So for today's topic, and for going into next week as well, we are going to cover the unification of Germany. Now, I have covered the Italian unification a couple of years ago on this channel, but I was able to do that in largely a single video because Italian unification was a little bit straightforward compared to German, where German unification had a little bit more complications to it due to the politics of Central Europe that came into play. So, for the period of German unification today that we're going to cover, today I'm going to go ahead and we're going to cover the half from about 1806, from the collapse of dissolution, I should say, of the Holy Roman Empire, until about 1854. So, right up until right after the 1848 revolutions that rock Europe in terms of liberal revolutions that really try to overthrow the monarchical conservative establishment in Central Europe and Europe as a whole. In France, they did succeed. In other countries like Germany, or what would become Germany, they did not. So that is what we'll cover today. And then going into next week, we'll cover the next period, which would be like Bismarck and, the Franco-Prussian War and the German Empire actually coming out of that. So, in order to do this more efficiently, we're going to go ahead and split it into two parts, which I deem would probably be more beneficial in terms of trying to cover it. So to begin with this video, we have to go back to 1806, really. I mean, we could go back further if we want to, but to get a definitive start, we're going to go back to 1806 when the Holy Roman Empire is nearing its final days. Now, prior to 1806, most of the German-speaking states within Central Europe had been part of the Holy Roman Empire, which had been founded all the way back during, I believe, if I'm not wrong, dates its lineage all the way back to like Charlemagne and his proclamation by the Pope as Holy Roman Emperor, and that goes to back about the year 800. So for 1,000 years, Central Europe and the German states in it have been largely unified under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire. And it wasn't an empire in terms of what we would typically think of. This was a much more loose empire. The emperor was actually elected, it was not a hereditary position. However, it gradually started to resemble that in some forms because since the 1400s, the elected members of the House of Habsburg had constantly become emperors. So the House of Habsburg, of course, one of the preeminent European royal imperial families, and they had gotten control of the Holy Roman Empire for at least 400 years by the time it actually had dissolved. And that was something that they would then kind of inherit a little bit because once it's broken up, Austria kind of becomes its own power, and they maintain their power in Austria up until the end of World War One, which I don't know if we've ever gone to that before, but maybe we'll cover that at some point with the Austria-Hungary, which will kind of tie in eventually later on. So in 1806, the Holy Roman Empire ends up becoming dissolved. It has been defeated by the French under Napoleon Bonaparte, and he utterly dissolves this empire after having defeated it. He also defeats the semi-independent German kingdom of Prussia, and that further weakens the status of the Central European German states to the point that Napoleon can kind of dictate his whims over them. So in 1806, Napoleon officially dissolves it. He gets rid of the Holy Roman Empire. It is officially done and over with after 1,000 years. The Habsburgs will maintain their control, as we said, over most of what is now German Austria, which, mind you, when we say German Austria, we're talking about the part of Austria that was specifically within the German realm, German speaking. And as a consequence of Napoleon dissolving the Holy Roman Empire, he will create what he calls the Confederation of the Rhine, which mostly is kind of like this big buffer state and counter state that he kind of creates in order to try to play off of Prussia and Austria. He knows that Prussia and Austria are going to be the two major opponents in Central Europe going forward. He wants to further weaken them, so he takes all the other German states within Central Europe and kind of puts them in this little French controlled confederation. It says Confederation of the Rhine, but it's truly under French hegemony. I mean, they don't really have a lot of independence on their own. They're largely under French first the under the rule of the first French Empire. And under that French hegemony, the sense of nationalism among the German people within the Confederation of the Rhine, and even among people in Prussia, and even a little bit in Austria, it's really going to start to thrive during the years of the Napoleonic Wars after they end up getting the Holy Roman Empire dissolved. Napoleon's campaigns into Poland, Iberia, and which if you don't know it as Iberia, it's Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, and Russia would also disillusion many Germans to French rule. The invasion of Russia alone, which we all know ended in disaster, had actually included 125,000 German troops that had kind of gone in and been recruited to serve in the French army in Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And of course, we all know how that ended. Napoleon fails to take Russia. I think he does get to Moscow, if I remember right, but he ends up failing to take the country as a whole. He ends up retreating as the winter comes in, and they're not prepared for this at all. So they end up having the problem of, you know, they're going back and it's dead winter and it's Russian winter. They're not prepared. They're starving to death. They're freezing to death. And these 125,000 German troops that are part of that army are going to have a massive disillusionment experience under French rule that they're going to carry home with them and say, why should we be supporting Napoleon? He's simply using us as basically cannon fodder in his wars of conquest. Napoleon's continental system that he also had for his economic control of the continent would also nearly ruin the Central European economy. As a consequence of all of these events that come, these negative events that flicked the German people during the time of Napoleon, there is a massive surge in nationalism, pride in their nationality, pride in their language. That we ruled ourselves just fine for 1,000 years. We can do it again. We just need to throw your Napoleon off. And it is during this time that you have the start of student militias, and student militias will begin forming during the time of Napoleon's kind of hegemony over Central Europe. And it's formed mostly by students who are dreaming of freeing Central Europe from Napoleon's control. The French defeat in Russia in 1812 would not only disillusion the Germans further with Napoleon's conquest, but it would also finally loosen his grip on the German states because now Russia is in the ascendancy, is able to come back and kind of chase the French out of Russia, and that brings them up into Central Europe. Napoleon's hold on that area of Europe is now greatly weakened. Within a year, in 1813, the French would actually try to forcibly reassert control over Central Europe and what is now Germany in a new campaign, which would culminate in the Battle of Leipzig, which saw over 500,000 combatants, and it would actually end French power east of the Rhine River. German troops would also be instrumental in Napoleon's final downfall in 1814 and at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, mostly under Prussian leadership. So before we go much further here, we got one picture I will show immediately. So this is a map prior to 1806. I believe this is the late 18th century, so about maybe 20 or 30 years before it is dissolved. So this is what the Holy Roman Empire would have somewhat looked like toward the end of its rule. So, as we can see, the empire is a collection of a multitude of German states that are just all pressed into one. You have some big contenders, obviously. We have up here in the blue is the Kingdom of Prussia, and then we also have what will become the Kingdom of Austria, which at that time is mostly known as Bohemia, but what will become Habsburg Austria. But all these other states will largely get consolidated into what Napoleon calls the Confederation of the Rhine when he ends up dissolving that empire in 1806. But if you've ever, and just an allusion here to a little bit of wider history, most of us know that Adolf Hitler, of course, he's not in any way connected with the topic of this video in terms of what we're discussing, But what I'm trying to debate here is everyone knows that Adolf Hitler called his regime the Third Reich. And you might ask, well, what was the first and the second one? Well, the Holy Roman Empire is typically regarded as in Germany as being the First Reich, and it was up to that point. So this, when you hear the Third Reich, and when you're going over World War II, and you're hearing Hitler call his regime that, he's doing that because he regarded this, as many Germans did. The Holy Roman Empire was regarded as the First Reich, and the Second Reich was the German Empire that would come about after German unification that ended in World War One. So just a little background there to that little term. So Napoleon's been defeated. 1815 has come about. Europe is once again at peace. And now the question is going to come about, are the German people going to get some sort of a nation state for themselves after having contributed during the war to the defeat of Napoleon, to the defeat of the French hegemony? They're not going to get what they want. And that mostly is because of the conservatism of the great powers of Europe at that time, in particular that of Austria and Prussia and Britain and Russia. France isn't really so much a party to this as in terms of what they should be, but they are part. So many of the German peoples, upon the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, they're very proud of their accomplishments. They desire a national German state in Central Europe, something similar maybe to what they had had with the Holy Roman Empire, and they want it composed of all of the German states and the kingdoms that are within Central Europe. However, the most ardent opposition to this idea of a nationalistic German state is Austria, which is still under Habsburg rule because the Habsburgs fear that a German nationalistic state could cause them to lose their power, could lose their throne, and they don't want to do that. They don't like these liberal ideas of a nationalistic state coming about. So they are utterly opposed to any creation of a German nationalistic state. And since Austria was one of the main powers that comes over it that was in the Napoleonic Wars, they of course have a major negotiating seat at the conference table at the Congress of Vienna. Austria also feared a nationalistic German state because they also feared the influence that the rival kingdom of Prussia had over many of the smaller German states and kingdoms. And they feared again that giving this some sort of a nationalistic state would somehow give Prussia control of that. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the great powers would, instead of establishing a German nationalistic state, they would establish what they called the German Confederation, which was intentionally designed to keep the German states weak, only to basically serve as a defensive mechanism in case they were attacked. But it was intentionally designed to keep them weak and keep them from being unified, mostly in accordance with the conservative wills of Austria and Russia and some of the other great powers. It would include the German Confederation would include pretty much all of the German states of Central Europe. It would include Prussia, Austria, and 38 smaller states. And much to Prussia's resentment, Austria would pretty much lead the Confederation because the Austrian emperor would be the well, not the Austrian, yeah, the Austrian emperor, so the Habsburg ruler, would be the president of the new parliament of the German Confederation, which was the federal diet, which would meet in the German city of Frankfurt. It would be dominated largely by Austria and Prussia, though, and that is going to lead to complications later on. So the German Confederation sets up this loose organization of these German states that, it's pretty much a defensive alliance in economic sphere. But what makes it worse is none of the German states can just withdraw out of the Confederation whenever they please. It's not that kind of a confederation. They're kind of forced into it. And confederation law would take would take precedent over any of the individual laws passed by the individual members. So it's kind of a binding agreement that none of them really wanted, none of them really agreed to, except for Austria, of course, and to some degree Prussia, except Prussia hated the fact that Austria would largely be in charge of this. But yeah, it's not what the nationalists were hoping to get, and it's intentionally designed to keep the German peoples kind of divided. And another reason why outside powers would have been opposed to this, let's think of this. Britain has the largest empire in the world at that point. Russia as well has a very large empire. The Bourbons in France are keen on restoring a French empire or some kind of a French hegemony in the world. And they're not really wanting a massive change in the balance of power within Europe itself. In the emergence of a unified German nation state in the heart of Europe, could be massively upsetting to that balance of power because now all of a sudden you have a massive new challenger. Now, when that eventually does come about, it is exactly what these other great powers fear. Germany becomes the most industrialized, most productive nation in Europe within 10 or 20 years of its formation and outpaces all of the other European countries. They realize that if the German states ever unify, there's a massive threat of them becoming highly competitive within a very short frame of time just due to the natural resources that Germany has and due to many other things that they have. And they would massively become a hindrance and a massive, kind of wrench in the machine that would disrupt this whole balance of power that had been set up in Europe. And they didn't want that. So they wanted to keep Germany as long as possible like separate little states. They did not want a unified nation. That's why many of the outside powers weren't willing to really support the idea of German unification. So let me see here. I think we have a map of the German Confederation here of what it looked like. Now, it would last fairly long. The German Confederation would largely last until 1866, which we'll get to in the second half of a video because we know how that all goes. So here we have the Deutschbund, which is the German Confederation. And this was the German Confederation largely as it existed between 1815 at its creation and 1866 at its dissolution. So as we can see, it's most of the German states that had comprised the former Holy Roman Empire. Prussia has gotten a little bit of enlargement during this time. So up here is Prussia. We have some of the smaller states here. We have, Württemberg is in here, Bavaria is in here, and then of course the main dominant power is Austria or Österreich. Kaiserreich Österreich is what Austria is in German. And then Frankfurt, let me see if I can find Frankfurt on the map here. I don't know. Yes, Frankfurt, the capital, well, semi-capital of the German Confederation, not really capital, but where the Confederation's Diet would meet is in the city of Frankfurt. So that would be right here. So basically, a united German Confederation, but not really a not a nation state, not what the nationalists have been hoping to get as an outcome of the Congress of Vienna, which is a detriment to them. So after 1815, German nationalists would initially ally with the concepts of liberalism. They realized that conservatism had played a very major part and large role in why the German Confederation had been formed. They realized that conservatives were largely opposed to a German nation state, so they start to ally with the polar opposite of conservatism, and they ally with liberalism. Now, this would one day begin to change. As we know, Bismarck was no liberalist. He was very much a conservative, but he still played a major role in German unification. That would one day end up flipping. But initially, during the first half of the 19th century, a majority of German nationalists are allied with the concepts of liberalism. And the main body of people that is leading the nationalistic push within the German states are students. Students were a major population group that had been influenced by nationalism and by liberal ideas. In 1817, 500 students would hold a popular demonstration at Wartburg Castle, which was a castle that Martin Luther had actually taken refuge in during the Reformation, and it was thus a German national and cultural symbol, and it was alluding to German national, pride and heritage in their role in world history. And so these students held this massive popular demonstration at Wartburg Castle. And this demonstration of over 500 students within just 2 years of the Congress of Vienna, it utterly frightened the conservatives within the German states, specifically the nobility. The nobility is largely conservative, and they absolutely are terrified by the idea of these liberal students getting together and actually kind of, protesting for the creation of a German nation state. It scares them of the rise of national sentiment for liberal ideas like popular sovereignty and wider participation in the political process, like, expanded suffrage and voting rights. And that utterly scares them. In 1819, German dramatist August von Kotzebue was assassinated by a radical student in a event gone wrong. Now, this assassination of a prominent German cultural leader would end up coming to a major disadvantage for the nationalists because it gives the excuse to the conservatives to take reputative measures. Not only would it rob the nationalist movement of intellectual leadership, but it's also going to, as we said, going to give the excuse for conservatives. The main conservative figure in German politics at this time, who is the major hindrance to any kind of creation of a German nation state, is Prince von Metternich of Austria. And he is definitely not a friend to liberals. He is one of the most conservative figures you would ever meet at the time. He was very instrumental in the creation of the German Confederation. He's a close ally of the Austrian emperor. He is not the kind of person that is going to ally with these liberals. And he sees the assassination as an opportunity, kind of, well, this nationalistic fervor. He uses the assassination of Kotzebue to consolidate legislation in the Frankfurt Diet in the German Confederation to limit the press and constrain liberal and nationalist movements. So basically, he uses the excuse of the assassination that, these guys are radicals. They're going to destroy everything. Kind of sounds similar to what a certain president says today, honestly. And he uses this excuse to then put through restrictions and censorship within the German Confederation that restricts the activity of these nationalistic and liberalistic students that are not liking what they're living under. And it drives the student led Burschenschaften, which is the student led organization that's really striving for nationalism, underground. Metternich's laws would also restrict the publication of nationalist materials, expanded censorship of the press and private correspondence, and limited academic speech by prohibiting university professors from encouraging nationalistic discussion. This sounds very similar to what we're living through today in some regards. Of course, the topics of what they're prohibiting and everything else has changed, but it sounds very similar, and that's the scary part. Economic unification was another idea that emerged in the German states that would further kind of play into the role of why should we not have a unified German state. The Zollverein was created in 1818 by Count von Bülow, the Prussian finance minister, and the Zollverein would link the Prussian and Hohenzollern territories that the Hohenzollerns ruled Prussia, and they had territories that weren't within Prussia, and it would link them through a shared customs union, basically trade. They wanted we're under the same ruler. Why should we have to pay trade, tariffs and imports on each other when we're ruled by the same ruler? Other German states would follow in joining in the following decades. It would reduce protectionist barriers between the states, the Zollverein did. It would also improve transport of raw materials and finished goods and make it easier to move across borders and less costly to buy, transport, and sell raw materials. So it's basically a massive good economic measure that comes about from the idea of the Prussians. The Zollverein was vital for the success of industrial centers, especially those that were starting to develop in the Prussian regions along the Rhine, such as the Rhineland, the Saar, and the Ruhr valleys. The states distant from the coast were the first ones to usually join in the customs union, as they were further away from the seaports, they were further inland, they didn't have sea access, they didn't have easy access to international markets, and thus they were a lot more kind of incentivized to want to join this customs union in order to avoid further increases in like protectionist barriers and tariffs and import taxes and all that stuff. They didn't want to have to deal with that, so this was an easier way for them to get through that quicker. The states in South Germany, for example, like Bavaria, were impacted since they faced an external tariff for access to the coast. Now, initially, the states in South Germany were more reluctant to join the Zollverein. It was a Prussian customs union after all, and since they're southern Germany, they tend to fall more under Austrian influence. And Austria is not a big fan of this, and Austria has its own sea access. They have no interest in joining the Zollverein. They have their own seacoast access. They don't need it. And they're kind of pressuring these southern German states. Don't you go join in Prussia. Don't you go allying with them. You're in our spear. And this kind of pressures like Württemberg and Bavaria to kind of back off and not join it initially. But and as a consequence, they're having to face external tariffs for access to the coast through Prussia, which at times has access to international markets that Austria does not. In 1836, by 1836, all the states in South Germany ended up joining the Zollverein with Prussia, except with the exception of Austria. The coastal states, however, as we mentioned, up to this point, it's largely the ones that are inland that are joining the Sulfaran because they are the ones that don't have sea access. The coastal states are in a different situation, like the states of Hanover, Brunswick, and Oldenburg. They have seacoast access. They don't need to worry about, tariffs and all that because they have straight access to international markets. They don't have a massive desire to join the Solveran because they're not facing tariffs. They can import right there in their own places. And thus, they join a lot later once they come under Prussian control. By the time they come under Prussian control, that's when they'll start joining, which I believe was by the 1840s, 1850s. The improved economies that the Solveran created within the German states that were part of it, would enable better modes of transportation to also be created. It would allow money to be diverted for the improvement of roads and for the construction of new railways. With all these improvements, the German states are becoming more connected than they ever had before, which is also making the spread of liberal and nationalistic ideas even easier to be done. This will lead us to the Hambach Festival and the conservative response that comes with it. Now, despite the efforts of conservative elites like Prince Metternich, which, before we go much further, I do have a portrait of the man, since he is so vital to this discussion early on. In fact, we'll show the one for Wartburg as well. So let's see, is that Metternich? Oh, we'll get that one too, because we need both of these. And there's Mr. Metternich. So this is Prince Metternich of Austria. He is the main person that is the obstacle from 1815 to 1848 in the creation of any kind of a German nationalistic state because he fears that doing so will lead to the decline of Austria's power and influence. And then here we have a depiction of the 500 students marching up to Wartburg Castle in 1817. So they were marching up to that, carrying the flag of the student-led organizations of a black, red, and gold that will eventually today is actually the national flag of Germany, and it was a common used flag by the student organizations that wanted a German national state. And then I'll hold off on that one for a second. So, despite the efforts from conservative elites like Metternich, who didn't want any kind of a German national state to come about, the ideas of unity joined with notions of popular sovereignty, would eventually create more liberal uprisings that would kind of garner their attention. The most notable of these would probably be what we know as the Hambach Festival in May of 1832, that would see over 30,000 people gather at the ruins of Hambach Castle. It was initially passed off as just being a county fair. It wasn't passed off as a liberal intellectual gathering. And this is what it was announced at. It was just going to be a simple county fair. We're not doing anything suspicious. But its participants would end up celebrating liberal ideals like liberty, national unity, and fraternity. It would take place around the ruins of Hambach Castle in Bavaria. There would be nationalist orators at the Hambach Festival that gave, speeches and lectures about, the need for German unification, the hope being that an educated populace would one day accomplish unification once that was taught why it was needed and why it was so desired. Metternich responded just as harshly as he had in 1819 to this Hambach Festival. He used Hambach to push conservative policy. In June of 1832, the Frankfurt Diet would pass 6 articles that would reaffirm the principle of monarchical authority. It would also add a further 10 articles on July 5th by reiterating censorship of political organizations and nationalist education. Prince Reed of Bavaria, in accordance with these articles, would actually lead the army of Bavaria to Hambach and arrest and imprison several of the speakers that had actually given speeches or lectures there. And this is a depiction of the Hambach Festival at Hambach Castle by over 30,000. This is a lot more than the 500 students in 1817. Food crises in the 1840s would further enrage the population because they realized that the conservative elite doesn't really care about the lower classes. They are suffering from famine, from potato blight, the same related to the same blight that would strict the Irish nation at about the same time. And they realize that the government isn't really doing anything to help them out. The government isn't, doing any kind of relief efforts to kind of solve our problem. And, why should we continue to rule under the current status quo when they obviously don't care about the lower classes? The governments would fail to support their peoples, and industrialization led to an inequality. Now, while Prussia and Austria were making it known that they did eventually possibly wish to have some sort of a unification, they did not absolutely Prussia and Austria by the 1830s and 1840s are starting to consider the prospects of what a German unification could mean. However, the problem comes about that each of the two different kingdoms wants to lead it on their own. They want to be the person responsible for leading German unification, and the political rivalry between them is going to complicate that issue. They would inhibit which because of each state, because of Prussia and Austria both wanting to be the main leader in German unification, this means that any move by the other to accomplish so would be inhibited by the other. If Prussia took a move to get it done, Austria would do anything it could to stop it. If Austria did the same thing, Prussia would respond by trying to inhibit Austria from doing so. This led to the German Confederation by the 1840s becoming split into Austrian and Prussian factions. States that sided mostly within Austria's sphere of influence, and states that were mostly siding within Prussia's sphere of influence. So, what we have here is building tensions. The people have been pushed down with liberal ideas. They want German unification, but the conservative nobility and government officials are against it. They don't want to upset the balance of power in Europe. They don't want to lose any power that they currently have themselves. And this resentment from the people that's already starting to fester in the 1840s and 1830s is going to come to a head by the end of the 1840s in the revolutions that rage across Europe in 1848 into 49. In Germany, they were not I won't say they weren't bloody, but I don't think they were as bloody as in other states, like, France ended up having revolutions and Austria ended up having a revolution of its own. Revolutions would break out across several of the German states in 1848 and 1849. Revolutionaries would pressure the state governments to adopt a parliamentary assembly that would draft a constitution for a national German state. Many of the revolutionaries hoped that a constitution would accomplish unification by several matters. Number one, it would establish universal male suffrage. Number two, a national parliament that would unify Germany officially. And number three, since Austria was kind of busy on its own, and Austria at this point was becoming clear that it was the main inhibitor to German unification, they wanted the Prussian king as the leader of this unified German state, as Prussia was also the strongest and largest German state as well. On March 27th of 1849, the Frankfurt Parliament would pass the Paulskirchen Verfassung, which was known as the Constitution of St. Paul's Church, which was passed in St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt. And this was a nationalistic assembly that was set up. This was not Frankfurt Diet. This was a parliament that was set up by a elected body of nationalists. They offered King Frederick William IV of Prussia the title of Kaiser, which is German for emperor. William would actually decline the crown when it was offered to him for several reasons that he gave. Number one, he said that I need the consent of the different German states, meaning I need the consent of the ruling princes and monarchs, not of the people. You do not rule your states. The princes and monarchs do. Number two, he feared the opposition that would come from such a move that if he did accept the crown, what response would come from Austria once it was done dealing with its own revolution, and what would likely come from Russia as well, which was allied with Austria at this point, and would probably see the Prussian acceptance of a crown of a German nationalistic state as Prussia kind of rebelling against the status quo, and he feared that Austria and Russia would probably intervene militarily. And the third reason they gave was that he would not accept a crown of clay, as he put it, from an elected parliament. He argued, I have my crown of Prussia from God. Why would I accept a crown that was given to me from the dirt by a bunch of peasants? Not exact. He's a very conservative figure in his thinking. The Frankfurt Parliament would officially disband after the 1840 failed 1848-49 revolutions, when the king simply downturned what the people were wanting to give him. And in 1850, Prussia would create the Erfurt Union. Now, this was a federation. This marked the first point where Prussia's really starting to actually break off from Austria and show that they're willing to possibly take the lead on a German unification. And it is a federation of German states, much like the German Confederation, but it excludes Austria in the Erfurt Union. However, Austria and its ally Russia kind of pressure Prussia to back off of this. Like, no, you're not going to create your own union here. You're going to stay within the German Confederation that's under Austrian control. And they forced Prussia to back off of it and abandon the Erfurt Union by 1854 and go back into the German Confederation. So, by the end of this first half of the 19th century, the main question regarding German unification is becoming focused not on when it's going to happen, but how it's going to happen. It's becoming clear that the people want it. It's becoming clear that Prussia is even at this point starting to consider having it in some form because the Prussian king didn't say I'm opposed to it. He just said the manner of which you're trying to do it right now is not something I can agree with because you have not gotten the proper authority from your rulers and it's being offered to me not by the princes but by the people, by an elected parliament. So the Prussia is not saying that they're opposed to a German unification, but Frederick William IV isn't willing to do it by the manners of which it's offered in 1848 and 49. What is becoming the major question is how is German unification going to be done and what size is it going to involve? Is it going to include all of the German speaking lands that German speakers reside in and speak the German language? In that case, we would have a Großdeutschland, which is Greater Germany, which would include Austria and any nation state that ends up getting formed. Or are we going to pursue what seems to be a lot more likely to happen since Austria is so absolutely detrimentally opposed to this, and Austria has its own multi-ethnic empire that it's going to have to bring into the fold? Are we going to pursue Klein Deutschland, a lesser Germany, without Austria and exclude Austria entirely? This is the question that is going to become the main driving factor going into the last 20 years until unification, when Prussia is trying to make the decision, do we move without Austria, or do we somehow try to seek and get Austria in, even though they're our absolutely arch rival? That is where we will pick up next week when we cover with Bismarck and the Franco-Prussian War and the Austro-Prussian War. We will cover that all next week going into that. But the big question at the end here, do we want a Klein Deutschland, a lesser Germany without Austria, or do we go for a Großdeutschland, a greater Germany with Austria included, at least German-speaking Austria? So for some final images that we have here, here is a depiction of St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt out with German tricolor flags of the Nationalist Assembly during the 1848 to 49 revolutions, where the St. Paul's Constitution was made. Then here we have a depiction drawn up by nationalist artists at the time of kind of a unified Germania, with Germany symbolized a unified German state symbolized by the symbol of Germania, with her shackles broken by her feet, her holding the nationalist flag and a German eagle. Here we have a picture of King Frederick William IV of Prussia, who was offered the crown of a unified German state in the revolutions of 1848 to 49, but he ultimately downturns it because he doesn't agree with what the manner of it's been offered to him. And then here we have a map showing kind of the concept of, do we want a Klein or Großdeutschland, with where the areas in Central Europe where there are a majority of German language speakers, and that is going to become the question. Do we include all of these areas in green, or do we exclude Austria here? So that's going to become the question moving forward. So that concludes for today's video. So next week, as I said, we will cover the second half of this, going into Bismarck and his realpolitik and Prussia actually accomplishing the unification of a German state through the German Empire, but we will hit that next week. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any added detail or stuff that you want to add, feel free to put that in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to go through it when I can. But that concludes for this week's video. So hopefully everyone has a wonderful weekend going into the weekend. I know it's Father's Day this weekend. Spend time with your fathers. And we'll see you all back here next week for our next video when that comes out. So until then, hopefully everyone stays well, and we'll see you then.